My name is Christine Linnell, and I'm talking to Dr. Richard Slaughter for Futures Trust Aotearoa. I wanted to start with this idea of navigating the Anthropocene, is the title of your presentation. And at first glance, I think a lot of people would assume that this is just about climate change, but it seems to be a much broader topic than that. What exactly is the Anthropocene?
A scientist, I've forgotten his name, was in the middle of a presentation some years ago when this term came to him as an appropriate term to use. And what it really means is anthro, human, Pocene, era. So this is the era that human beings are modifying the way the planet works. And a number of people have started to gather around the idea that this is a useful term to use because it really highlights, I guess, our responsibility for what happens from here on in. So Anthropocene simply means that the human era, or the era of human effects on the planet.
Reading your book, The Biggest Wake-Up Call in History, I was quite interested in your descriptions of Las Vegas and Dubai. What do those cities mean to you?
Entropy.
Entropy.
They basically mean the input of a tremendous, absolutely mind-boggling amount of energy, human effort, materials, water, in places that just simply, it's almost contradictory, because that kind of operation can only be a temporary exception to the general flow of life and how life works on this planet. So to me it's the end of an era, the end of a sort of way of thinking, the end of high industrial overshoot and demand on the planet's resources.
I was also interested that you wrote about the role of organized crime, or the shadow as you call it at one point. And I thought that people might think, well, organized crime, that's just the mafia or maybe Bernie Madoff, that doesn't really affect me directly. What kind of influence does organized crime have in the world?
It has major influences. Some of them are subtle, some aren't. You might say that the whole world of organized crime is acting like a parasite on society, in that it is leaching away energy, raw materials, people, again, whose positive efforts are needed elsewhere. But perhaps another way to grasp it is to say that the kind of values that organized crime is working out of, which are selfish, self-centered, materialistic values, which really takes no responsibility for what they do or for the world they live in. Those sorts of values lead very quickly to the end of the human experiment. They are simply not viable, and they're only possible because small numbers of people are indulging in these sort of ways of behaving. I guess a key book there is Roberto Saviano's book called Gomorrah, which is a tremendous insight into the way that the mafia around the Naples area worked. If I can give you one quick example, some very bright sparks in Italy belonging to these organizations decided they would solve two problems in one go: how to get rid of chemical waste from factories and how to distribute mulch around farms. And they actually put the two together. So they got the chemical waste from the factory, they mixed it with mulch, and they sold it to farmers in the south. That gives you a kind of sense of the kind of diminished rationality that drives them. In Saviano's book, he describes the landscape around Naples, many of the areas absolutely wrecked for generations. So on a surface level, it might not impinge on us directly in our everyday lives, but working in the background, organized crime is a degrading force of enormous power, which is actually the last thing we need at this point in history.
When you talk about a global collapse, this overshoot and collapse scenario, a lot of people might think about, science fiction or maybe the movie The Day After Tomorrow. What might the overshoot and collapse scenario look like?
It all depends on how fast this process takes place. You can argue that we're living in the middle of a slow collapse now, because we've seen ocean fisheries collapse, we've seen various parts of the terrestrial landscape become unfit for human habitation while the population increases. I think the dramatic manifestation of collapse is when something happens fairly quickly, when you see the cod industry off Newfoundland just go from very productive over decades suddenly to almost nothing in a short time. With these critical thresholds, when we cross a critical threshold in a particular area, that's when we see a dramatic crash. So the issue now is we are facing a whole series of critical thresholds in terms of water supply, the viability of ecosystems on land, many of them in the ocean. The oceans are becoming more acidic. The oceans are full of plastic. That's just two ocean items. And if you look into the detail of that, the oceans are changing glacially slowly, but as a result of human impacts. Now, the thing about collapse, however, is that we mustn't just be sucked into catastrophic understandings of that, because if we can slow down this process of deterioration, we stop thinking so much about things falling apart suddenly out of control, as in a science fiction movie, and we begin to think about the path of descent, D-E-S-C, not D-I, which means that there's a lot more scope for human control, human agency, for us to do all sorts of things that moderate this path. We certainly have to come off the peak of the high industrial overuse of resources and energy and so forth, and incursion into natural systems. But when we do that, it's how we do that, the speed that it takes place, and the effectiveness of the sorts of actions that we undertake. If we get it right, we could actually have a relatively smooth, not perhaps smooth is exaggerated, but a relatively controlled descent. But if we get it wrong, then we will see these great jagged discontinuities, for example with oil, which we're still way too dependent on. So collapse is a complex issue. It depends on the speed, it depends on how you approach it, depends on the specific example that you're working with.
What is the main idea behind the integral method which you describe in your book, and how is it different from the approach that's used by, for example, Al Gore in Inconvenient Truth?
It's a good question. Part of the work that I did that went into the biggest wake-up call was to survey about 14 or 15 books that have been written about environmental issues. And what I found in all cases except one was that most people were writing about change in the physical world, changes to ecologies, to climates, CO2. That's obviously what Gore was dealing with. And in only one case, a Scottish writer I found who had also looked at what I call the human and cultural interiors. I think the point here is that what we see happening around us in the outer world is actually a consequence of the the many ways that our interior worlds operate, our values, our worldviews, how we perceive, how we frame, filters we use, all of us. And really the point of the integral perspective is that it brings all that into play. Instead of just dealing with externalities, the consequences of things downstream from these shaping interiors, we can actually address both. So what I particularly like about the integral perspective is the sense that everybody has part of the truth. The psychologists at one side who understand human development have their contribution. The scientists who are studying climate change have their contribution. And what the integral perspective does is allow you to put together in a fairly even-handed way contributions from many different fields. So it's a true transdisciplinary perspective.
So is it fair to say that doing this is basically about knowing your audience and shaping your message to suit different people?
That's simply one outcome of having an integral perspective, because you are sensitive to the fact that what I say may not be what you hear. What you hear will be a result of your own active processing, your own understanding, your own values, your own filters that are actually in active use within all of us. So if you have some insight into how those work, then you can certainly tune your messages. But the far bigger point is that we can actually understand where this civilization is coming from at that interior level, rather than just dealing with all the technology that maybe got invented ages ago.